Session 1. Chapter 3: The Unfinished Party. After spending 10 days with his brother and his family, brooding, reflecting, unwinding, avowing never to venture out on a journey after sundown, Nandi caught an early morning bus and returned to Jory a changed man. He was now a staunch believer that death is only an end to a body, not the spirit. A copy of the Holy Bhagavad Gita, the ancient Hindu scripture that conveys the philosophy of indestructibility of spirit, was now his cherished treasure. In fact, it still is. The last time I saw him a few years ago, the same old copy of Bhagavad Gita was prominently lying on his bedside table. It was providential that watchman Jarku was on duty at the time I was being chased by the spooky entity. Uncle Nandi recalled the incident that was still so fresh in his mind even after years had gone by. I had lost all hope of escaping alive that night. You know, the sight of a lottie-wielding man holding a kerosene lantern became a symbol of trust and security for me ever since. He smiled and shook his head. Way back then, Nandi had posed a question one evening during his stay at Wildflower Hall. Do you think that ghostly woman could have caused me serious harm? Like, could it have possessed my body or sucked out my soul? Pa had frowned and then chuckled. Come on, Nandi. She might not be a ghost at all. I think she was after you because she found you very attractive, a suitable bachelor. You better get married quickly, before you get killed by the young women running after you. Nandi had paled, recalling Desraj's story. I was joking, but how close to truth he was. It was a ghost, by G, I'm sure, he insisted. And, I also believe that she traveled with me in the truck. She followed me right from where the bus had broken down. The ghost must have been outside the broken-down bus all the time, hovering, waiting for the opportunity, or was she with us inside the bus? Nandi had wondered. He was grateful to him for being his redeemer that night. All through his stay at Wildflower Hall, he had time and again let Jarku know how thankful he was. That had pleased Jarku to no end. Jarku would have also boasted about the whole incident had his boss not strictly warned him against revealing it to anyone. As the principal of the institute, Pa strictly wanted to avoid rumors floating in the campus. Don't go around blabbering about the incident to anyone, Jarku, Pa had stridently instructed him. No spreading of tales about what you and Nandi saw the other night. No, Sahib, I won't. My mouth is sealed, he had assured, and had kept his promise. Time passed. Monsoons arrived and departed. The snow and winters covered the landscape in a desolate white, keeping people indoors and fires burning in the hearths. Cool summer sluggishly began to replace the cold wet spring of the mountains. The wheel of seasons continued rolling, and with it day-to-day mundane affairs of life. The supernatural occurrence was more or less forgotten. But the fear of the close presence of restless souls remained for some in the recesses of their minds, which forbade them from even mentioning them. At the end of April 1957, Pa received his promotion and transfer orders. He was to join the head office at Shimla. His post at Wildflower Hall was to be filled by Mr. Kulkarni, who was coming from Delhi to take over as the new principal. We were to move out of Wildflower Hall and head for Shimla once. Pa had personally handed over the charge to Mr. Kulkarni. Pa got busy winding up his work at the institute and Ma got busy packing up. Since the east wing of the main building was still occupied by us, Pa decided to temporarily arrange for the new principal's stay at the cottage. The cottage was situated about 50 meters southeast of the main building, bordering a dark coniferous forest. A downhill incline, hidden under a bounty of firs and cedars, began right from the rear end of the cottage. It was a snug unit of a large sitting room, 2 comfortable bedrooms, a kitchen, and a bath. A well-kept garden in front imparted it a quaint picture of a typical English house. During the erstwhile rule of the British, this cottage seemed to have accommodated the manager of the hotel. Its isolation was ominous. In the beginning of his tenure, Pa had offered it to the vice principal, but he had barely stayed there for 2 days, at the end of which he requested to be lodged in the main building. "I'm single and need only a small unit to stay," he justified. Even using the cottage on a shared basis was not acceptable to anyone. Why no one wanted to stay in the cottage, Pa never gave it much thought, for he had no clue that rumors were rife in the school about a mysterious presence in the cottage. Consequently, the cottage got reserved for special guests of the institute. It was opened once in a while for cleaning, but mostly remained vacant and locked. Now the cottage was opened after months for a thorough cleaning, to make it livable for the new principal and his wife. Bolub, a young boy in his late teens who had joined the staff only 2 months ago, was assigned the duty. Equipped with cleansers, brooms, mops, and dusters, Bolub opened the lock and entered the cottage around 9 in the morning. The house was icy cold and oddly dissuading. The moment he started his work, he began to hear strange whispers. Was the broom he was using making funny sounds? He stopped, stood still, but the whispers persisted. He realized that the voices were coming from behind him. He looked around wondering who else was in the cottage. Had someone sneaked in as he had left the door ajar for fresh air? He inspected the rooms, but found no one. He resumed his work, ignoring the murmurs. But they were getting louder. The sounds kept following him. He shivered inside his warm clothing. After sweeping the floors, he sat on a chair to rest. The murmurs were draining him. He pressed and released his ears a number of times to stop the buzzing. Slowly the sound subsided. Perhaps he needed to see a doctor. After resting for 5 minutes, he got up to resume his work. The whispers immediately returned. He tried ignoring the strange voices, but they were getting stronger. Then he heard the first clear words, "Get out." He looked around. Perhaps the voice had leaked in through the window, though he couldn't spot anyone outside. Shaking his head, he walked into the bedroom and picked up the bed cover to change the bed linen. It was then that he felt a strong shove. He held on to the side table. "Get out." The angry growling voice was near and distinct. Someone seemed to be standing right next to him, totally invisible. He stood frozen, looking around the stark empty room. Then he watched in horror as the pillow from the bed rose on its own and came hurtling towards him. He dodged, and then panting, trembling, screaming, gasping, he rushed out of the cottage and straight into the principal's office. Pa patiently listened to Bolub's report. His shivering body and pale face were proof enough that he had actually experienced something that had intensely scared him. But pillows hurtling through the air, on their own? The boy had surely a fabulous imagination. Nevertheless, for a moment, Pa got worried. Were there really supernatural activities happening around? First Nandy, and now Bolub? But he shook this thought out of his mind. The boy was exaggerating. He was barely 18, and immature. He summoned Bishnu, in charge of the maintenance, and asked him to stay with Bolub till he finished his work. Bolub refused outright. Nothing could pursue him to return to the cottage. The experience had unnerved Bolub so intensely that he asked to be relieved from his job. He would go home and later seek a job elsewhere. "This place is spooky, sir, not safe," he declared. Pa rubbished the whole episode as fictitious fear of a weak-minded juvenile, and allowed him to leave. Vishnu was equally hesitant to enter the cottage. He had heard that the paranormal activity around the cottage had increased lately. But he couldn't decline the orders. He collected a team of a few bravehearts, including Jarku. They first scouted the cottage, loudly chanting prayers. The cottage had never felt that cold. They also felt an unexplained presence, as if someone was keenly watching them, following them, yet keeping distance. Perhaps prayers were working. 2 days before my family was to depart for Shimla, Mr. and Mrs. Kulkarni arrived a little before lunchtime. The sky was partly cloudy and the balmy sunshine repressed the feel of the approaching summers. But for the couple, having come from the summer heat of Delhi, it was almost like experiencing winters again. The Kulkarnis were in their late 30s and childless. The excitement of being posted at a famous building sitting in the lap of the Himalayas was writ large on their faces. The institute's staff and students had gathered to extend them a hearty welcome. "This is our first time on the mountains, and we're going to love it here," Mr. Kulkarni announced heartily, and his wife nodded enthusiastically, wrapping her shawl around her. They both seemed like school children going for a picnic, their thrill at the prospect of living in such heavenly surroundings exuded from their very mannerism. A few staff members exchanged glances. Some shook their heads in pity. Jarku and Vishnu, standing at the back of the group, bowed their heads and said silent prayers. After the initial welcome, introductions, and hot cups of tea, the couple settled in the cottage. "What a lovely little joint," Mrs. Kulkarni remarked, plunking herself on the sitting room sofa. "Except it's exceptionally cold in here," Mr. Kulkarni added, rubbing his hands to warm them. "I know, I felt it as soon as I entered. I have asked the caretaker to keep the heaters on." After freshening up, the couple joined my parents for lunch. Mrs. Kulkarni, happy and excited, twittered throughout. Afterwards they were taken to the garden for a relaxed cup of coffee. Jarku and Vishnu, standing at the back of the group, bowed their heads and said silent prayers. After the initial welcome, introductions, and hot cups of tea, the couple settled in the cottage. "What a lovely little joint," Mrs. Kulkarni remarked, plunking herself on the sitting room sofa. "Except it's exceptionally cold in here," Mr. Kulkarni added, rubbing his hands to warm them. "I know, I felt it as soon as I entered. I have asked the caretaker to keep the heaters on." After freshening up, the couple joined my parents for lunch. Mrs. Kulkarni, happy and excited, twittered throughout. Afterwards they were taken to the garden for a relaxed cup of coffee. "Absolutely, your choice." Pa shrugged his shoulders. "But, may I warn you, it can get lonely at times." He was anxious for their well-being after the recent incidents, even as he pretended to be a skeptic. But Mrs. Kulkarni rubbished his proposal. "I have suffered enough noise of the crowded cities. Now I want to enjoy peace of this isolated cottage." She cheerfully stretched her legs and added, "I'm thoroughly going to enjoy the tranquility of this stunning mountain resort." "Did you say it was once a luxury hotel, during the British era?" Mr. Kulkarni watched his wife devotedly. He was clearly pleased at her being so happy. After lunch, Pa and Mr. Kulkarni left for the office. Ma advised Mrs. Kulkarni to rest for the afternoon. She needed it after the long journey. But the novelty of the place had given the lady extra agility. She spent the entire afternoon inspecting the gardens, the surrounding areas, and basking in the sun. And it was only late in the evening that she entered the cottage. By now, darkness had begun to creep in as softly as a prowling predator, waning Mrs. Kulkarni's zeal. The calls of the nocturnal creatures caused further dismay. She was a typical city-bred who had only seen crowds and clamor. The hush of the forlorn mountain dampened her spirit. On top of this, she had begun to hear strange whispers. Were there people outside, students or staff, talking in hushed voices? But the sound seemed to be coming from inside the cottage. She quickly took out Lord Krishna's idol from her bag, selected a prayer corner and sat down for her evening puja, earnestly waiting for her husband's return. When the couple joined my family for dinner, her concern was quite apparent. "Don't you ever feel scared living in this forsaken place?" Her paradoxical statement amused Ma. "Don't worry, you will soon get used to it." After dinner, the couple retired to the cottage as the long journey and the hectic activities of the day had worn them out. They went to bed around 10. And the long day's tiredness immediately overtook their conscious minds. Sometime at midnight, Mrs. Kulkarni woke up with a jolt. Something had woken her up from her deep sleep. She couldn't be sure of what it was. There was absolute stillness around now. The only sound she could hear was coming through the window, of rustling of leaves and a mild breeze. She had never in her entire life experienced such intense silence where one could even hear the sound of a soft breeze. Though she had a hunch that it was a louder sound that had woken her up. Someone had spoken to her, almost into her ears. An angry voice. Maybe it was a dream. Her husband suddenly muttered in his sleep. He then began thrashing his arms around, trying to lash out at something. That was strange. In their married life of 14 years he had never done that. She sat up, alarmed. "Honey, what's wrong?" she asked tenderly, but then he calmed down. He was probably very tired and anxious about his new job. Dismissing her anxiety as needless, and not wanting to disturb him, she softly got out of her bed to go to the bathroom. She switched on a small torch that she had kept on the bedside table. As she neared the bathroom door, she felt something brush past her. Distinctly. Someone had been in her way, and as she had approached the bathroom door, it had moved to a side to let her pass. In the torchlight she tried to pry around. Perhaps a cat had got inside the cottage. Wondering at the strange sensation, she went to use the toilet. She was still inside when she heard her husband's annoyed voice telling someone not to trouble him. Who was he speaking to? She hurried back. This time she decided to switch on the table lamp. Mr. Kulkarni was wide awake. He chided her for pulling at his blanket. And now switching on the lights. "What's wrong with you?" "I'm tired. I have plenty of work to do in the morning," he grumbled. She opened her mouth to explain, but he persisted. "I deserve to be allowed some decent sleep." He then pulled the blanket exasperatedly over his face and turned his back towards her. Mrs. Kulkarni was surprised at this unjustified ticking off. She hadn't even ventured near his bed. Annoyed, she switched off the light and slipped into her bed. The moment the cold darkness returned to the room, she distinctly heard some faint sounds. There was something in the cottage. Could be a cat, she reiterated her thought. But why would it pull at her husband's blanket? She couldn't sleep anymore. The penetrating silence began to get on her nerves. Perhaps accepting this posting at such an isolated place was not a good idea. But then they had no idea it would be so desolate, she mused in the deathly silence of the night. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Creak! The bathroom door groaned at the hinges. Her eyes flew wide open. Her heart jumped against her ribs. She had shut the door just a few minutes ago. She turned to check on her husband. Still with his back towards her, he was packed in his blanket and blissfully asleep. Then who had opened the bathroom door? She turned her head towards the door. Her heartbeat stopped. It was wide open now. Someone was standing there, facing her. Faint moonlight seeping through the curtains of the room revealed a flimsy, womanish figure in a flowing dress. Gh. Gh. Gh, but no more sound would emerge from her throat. She began to shake frenziedly. Was she dreaming? She shut and opened her eyes. The spectre was gone. She had perceived two frightful eyes, two dark holes staring at her, chilling her to her bones. But now a black hollowness inside a rectangular frame of the open door stared back at her. Who was she? Did I really see someone? Or was it just my imagination? My God, I'm going mad in this isolation. Then sounds from outside began to trickle in, faint and feeble. They were sounds of the tables being laid, and some distant voices. She heard clinking of glasses followed by more sounds in unison, like some toast being offered. There were more indistinct noises, and after that, the next sound was absolutely clear. Someone said, "Bara, chai lao." A woman's voice followed, "Bara, idhar aao." Sound of faint laughter could be heard now. The voices had a distinct British accent. Perhaps these two people are closest to the cottage. Nevertheless, the sounds were soothing to her ears. At least there was some human company. She could now hear waltz music in the distance. Then she heard a male voice, "Daphne, dance with me." Her mind began to work in a different direction. She was sure that some party was going on, from which she and her husband had been excluded. That upset her. When she was at dinner, no one had mentioned a late-night party to be held here. Not even a hint. Who were these people? She had spent almost the entire day here and hadn't seen any foreigners. She couldn't contain herself and voiced her opinion loudly to her husband and woke him up again. "Dear, there's a party going on outside." "I know. I hear them." "Perhaps the visitors arrived late," Mr. Kulkarni responded sleepily. "Please, sleep and let me sleep, dear." Mrs. Kulkarni considered her husband's opinion for a while and to her it seemed a likely explanation for the late-night party. This was also a matter of worry. Her husband and she were modest people, not at all the party-going types, had never touched alcohol in their lives. This place still seems under the British influence, though most of the British left the country 10 years ago. Maybe, some still live here, around this place. She lay in her bed wide awake, reflecting. Lost in these thoughts, she began to drift into sleep. The sounds continued. For a while, she had no idea for how long, and then slowly began to fade. Mrs. Kulkarni finally fell into a deep-rested sleep. Next morning was unlike the previous one. Cobalt sky and cheerful sunshine welcomed the residents. Kulkarnis were up early, tired and drained. The cottage didn't appear as cheerful as it had the previous day. There was an eerie sadness floating and filling the space. After the morning chores and the puja, the couple headed towards the main building. They wanted to eat there. Breakfast in the hostel mess, for they did not want to burden my mother. But Ma insisted that they should lunch with them, and they humbly accepted her invitation. After breakfast, Mr. Kulkarni joined Pa in the office. Mrs. Kulkarni did not go back to the cottage. Her sixth sense was dissuading her from being there alone. The spectre that she had seen momentarily last night was still unnerving her, though she was still confused whether it was real or just her misgiving. So she whiled away her morning by strolling in the terraced gardens around the main building. Ma had been very busy since the morning as we were to leave for our new destination the next day. She had once peeped through the window and had seen Mrs. Kulkarni sitting alone in the garden, looking lost. Since her packing was more or less over, Ma walked down to spend some time with the lady. She also arranged for 2 cups of tea to be sent to them. Mrs. Kulkarni was too happy to have company. The ladies fell into normal chit-chat about their families. Tea arrived. Mrs. Kulkarni took a sip of the hot beverage and then kept the cup on the table. She hesitated and then raised the topic of the late-night party to which she hadn't been invited. How was last night's party, Mrs. Sharma? Is it customary to give late-night parties here? No. What party are you talking about? Ma stared at her, puzzled. Perhaps the students had had a party last night. Ma frowned and shook her head. She had been staying here for over a year, and had no knowledge about any such activity having taken place the previous night, or for that matter on any other night, at least not since she had been here. Mrs. Kulkarni, there has never been any late-night parties within the premises of this institute. My husband is not the type to arrange, or even allow such parties. Seeing a mystified expression on her face, Ma continued, Wildflower Hall was a hotel once, when British ruled over us. They used to have parties here, enjoying life at the expense of us native Indians. But that's all over now. Mrs. Kulkarni had gone pale. She even shivered beneath her jumper and shawl. Ma continued, though we do have formal get-togethers to celebrate festivals, Holi, Diwali, or evening high teas for the guests once in a while, nothing more than that. Never. Yesterday night there wasn't any party. Neither at evening, nor at night. Ma settled Mrs. Kulkarni's doubt with finality, and took a few sips of tea. Mrs. Kulkarni stared at Ma with anxiety bordering on fear. Ma was unable to understand what was the matter with her. Was she somewhat crazy? There was complete silence for a while. Ma noted her wiping beads of sweat that had collected on her temples and wondered why she was so worked up. The staff and students have arranged for a farewell party for us in the evening, and of course you both will be our special guests. Ma tried cheering her up. That didn't help in easing Mrs. Kulkarni's anxiety. Ma watched her looking around dazed, her eyes wide with fright. Then her eyes came to rest on the huge oak tree growing close to the bedroom window of the cottage. It was a massive tree, had presumably been there for centuries. She turned back to Ma. Mrs. Sharma, there was definitely a party yesterday night, she asserted rather fervidly now. There were lots of sounds of clattering of crockery, clinking of glasses, and foreigners calling out to waiters to serve them. Bara, chai lao. I very clearly heard someone ordering. There was also music and dance, and there was also a woman called Daphne. I clearly heard this all happening last night. There is no question of being confused. It was Ma's turn to stare at Mrs. Kulkarni, dumbfounded. What was she blabbering about? Party outside, in the middle of the night, and English people? Where do you think the party was held? Ma asked her softly, now obviously a little anxious. She once again regarded the old oak tree, her eyes narrowed. She appeared confused and distressed, turning towards the building, as if trying to make up her mind. She finally concluded it was somewhere around that large tree, that one, close to the cottage's bedroom window. But then, why would anyone have a party outside the cottage? That doesn't make sense. She turned towards Ma with solid conviction. It must be outside the main building then. Ma was getting irritated at her persistence. Mrs. Kulkarni, just think, who would arrange for a party in the lawns on a cold night? Wouldn't it be practical to have an indoor party? We have a big and delightful dining hall for this purpose. It was once meant for ballroom dancing, for the British, she added. with vehemence. Besides, do you see any signs of any party here, or near that tree? The lady was stumped. Mrs. Kulkarni, your tea has gone cold. Let me go and order a fresh cup of tea for you. No, please no. Don't go, she pleaded and shivered. I even saw a woman in the cottage in the middle of the night. She stood at the bathroom door and then was gone. Her voice trailed away. She anxiously looked at Ma to see her reaction. Ma gasped and then decided there was no point discussing such things. She felt pity for the lady who was clearly delusional. It was all a figment of her imagination, though. Nandi's spooky experience too hovered at the back of Ma's mind. She then changed the topic. Make sure you have enough warm clothes, Mrs. Kulkarni, thick overcoats and woolen scarves. Winters here are quite severe. Not receiving any response, she continued, we can meet in Shimla one day and I can help you shop for the winter essentials. Mrs. Kulkarni nodded mildly. But summers are beautiful here, putting her empty teacup on the table, Ma declared, and in this season, you'll also find guchis growing on the slopes. They are the most expensive mushrooms, you know, as costly as silver. She laughed to ease the tension, but realized that Mrs. Kulkarni wasn't listening. She was continuously and anxiously surveying the surroundings. After spending half an hour with her, when Ma left to go back to her work, the lady was staring at the old oak, utterly confounded. An hour later, when they were together for lunch, Mrs. Kulkarni once again broached the subject of the previous night's party. Mr. Kulkarni seconded her report of the events. Although he had been very tired and sleepy, a few things had disturbed him. Firstly, it was my wife stroking my face and waking me up from my deep sleep. As if we are on a honeymoon, he guffawed. And then she kept tugging at my blanket. He turned to smile at his wife. What had come upon you last night, honey? You never ever did that before, not even when we were newly married. His wife stared at him blankly, baffled and scared, and embarrassed at his flagrant claims. What are you saying, dear? I never touched you or your blanket last night. I didn't even come near your bed, not even once. She then drew in her breath. The night scene played on her mind yet again, the apparition of a woman at the bathroom door, staring at her. There was a third unknown presence in the room, she was sure now. Though she had had a vision of a specter in her room, she now assumed that talking about it might fetch her ridicule. Except for Ma, nobody understood why she suddenly looked terribly startled. Mr. Kulkarni frowned at her reaction, but then went on, and then there was that party going on next to the cottage. People talking and other sounds. It was Pa's turn to be surprised. He had no information about any party having been held last night. And, within the premises of the Institute, without his knowledge? He proceeded with immediate investigations. Who would be a better person to begin the inquiry with than the night guard, Jarku? Jarku made a spontaneous appearance. At Pa's question regarding the party, he did not appear baffled, though his deepening scowl revealed his worry. There was no party, Sahib. What Sahib heard must have been the usual mysterious sounds. What mysterious sounds? Pa looked mystified. But he was not buying Jarku's explanation hands down. Mr. and Mrs. Kulkarni heard sounds of a party going on outside. Who was holding the party, he repeated, demanding an immediate explanation. No one, Sahib, Jarku insisted and then turned towards Mr. Kulkarni. Sahib, can you tell where the sounds seemed to be coming from? Were they coming from close to the large oak tree growing outside the cottage? Mr. Kulkarni didn't answer. He was apparently unsure. Mrs. Kulkarni seemed relieved. She smiled and nodded promptly and vigorously. A few sounds came from close to the large tree next to our bedroom window. Others were distant. Then she looked at Ma triumphantly. I told you so, Mrs. Sharma, didn't I? Sahib, I too have heard such sounds on a few occasions. They come once in a while from around the oak tree. Music too. And English people speaking. In the beginning, once, I went near the oak tree to check what was going on. There was nothing, no one, but what, Jarku? Pa sounded nervous. Sahib, someone unseen pushed me and said, get out. Now everyone was staring at Jarku uneasily. That's why I prefer to stay in the veranda of the main building and seldom venture beyond it. Never in the direction of the cottage at night. And my lantern is a big solace. Ghosts are afraid of the fire, I think. Mrs. Kulkarni's jaw fell open. She was visibly trembling. Mr. Kulkarni had discernibly paled. Jarku noted none and continued, I wanted to warn you about it, Sahib, when the arrangements were being made for Kulkarni Sahib's stay in the cottage. Many people have experienced strange things there. Mysterious encounters. They hid it from you, thinking you wouldn't believe. Like you didn't believe Nandi Sahib and Bolab. There was a nerve-wracking silence in the room now. Jarku hesitated and then said, Sahib, I have heard that this building used to be for the parties of the Gora Sahibs. Pa nodded gently, and wondered, had they also buried their dead here, under the old oak? Thereafter, Mr. and Mrs. Kulkarni blatantly refused to go anywhere near the cottage. The brave team of Jarku, Vishnu, and a few others brought their luggage to the main building. The cottage was locked and made redundant. Despite just a day-old acquaintance, Mrs. Kulkarni seemed the saddest to see us leave the next day. She hugged Ma with tears streaming down her cheeks. Merely 2 months later, Pa received an urgent letter from Mr. Kulkarni. He had sought his immediate transfer back to Delhi. His wife had fallen seriously ill. The doctors had diagnosed it as severe depression and mental disturbance. She had been advised an immediate change of location.